It is now my pleasure to call upon a colleague and a friend, Rabbi Andrew Baker, to take the floor next. Dr. Baker, Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure and honor to be here this afternoon. It was 15 years ago that the OSCE organized a first conference on anti-Semitism here in Vienna. The OSCE, as some of you know and as you've heard, now consists of 57 participating states. It takes decisions by consensus. So nothing is simple, nothing is easy. We've had these discussions about the title of this conference. When I look at this, I'm also reminded in the OSCE, we spell anti-Semitism with a hyphen. I know many scholars say we shouldn't do that, but in the OSCE, it would mean getting 57 governments to agree. So in the meantime, we just keep spelling it with the hyphen. But to something a little more serious, when this conference took place 15 years ago, the first of any international governmental organization focused specifically and only on the subject of anti-Semitism, there were many governments that had imagined we'll support one conference once. Well, what followed really was something quite different. A conference a year later in Berlin, hosted by the German government, an important declaration issued by the OSCE that spelled out commitments on behalf of these governments in fighting anti-Semitism, acknowledging that anti-Semitism had taken on new forms and manifestations, stating clearly that incidents, events in the Middle East and in Israel can never justify anti-Semitism. And frankly, in 2004, there were some political leaders who were doing almost exactly that. This was the beginning now of what has taken us over 15 years, more specific commitments, not always lived up to, but at least enunciated. And what I want to do this afternoon is to discuss really the role of governments, what they have done, what they should be doing in combating anti-Semitism today. And let me suggest three premises through which we can examine this. The first is very basic. Governments have an obligation to take care of, to provide security for their own citizens. The second, governments, at least in the Western democratic world, have a responsibility to allow the full and free exercise of religion. And the third, not quite a similar fundamental right, but something that we've heard echoed over the last number of years. It's sometimes phrased, Europe could not be Europe without Jews. France would not be France without Jews, etc. So let's take this as a genuine expression of the importance, not simply of individual Jews to Europe, but of Jewish life, of a Jewish community. And with this in mind, let's look at what some of the critical issues today are when we discuss fighting or bringing an end to anti-Semitism. To the basic issue of security, it is still a very real challenge. It wasn't an easy process, first to get governments to recognize this problem, to even begin to monitor, to collect data. Governments were blind, essentially, They had to be pushed and prodded by their own Jewish communities. And even then, it was a complicated and problematic process. In my OSCE role, I've had the opportunity to take this issue up in various capitals. I can recall half a dozen years ago in The Hague, in the Netherlands, government officials saying, all right, maybe there's a security problem Jews face, but if we're going to do something, it can't be just for Jews. It can't be just for synagogues. What about churches? What about mosques? The question of what security challenges they faced was secondary. Instead, it was essentially, we have to be equal in dealing with this issue. So equality essentially meant not dealing with the problem that the Jewish community faced. In Belgium, when this issue came up, government officials said, we acknowledge the Jewish community faces something very serious. In fact, we have equated the threat level facing Jewish institutions in Belgium to be equal to the threat level faced by the American embassy in Brussels, by the Israeli embassy. But they don't have the same kind of security, and the government acknowledged they didn't have the resources to provide that security. So, some progress, they admit there's a problem, but no real effective action to provide the solution. Raya, you mentioned yesterday, this is virtually the 3-year anniversary of the attack in Copenhagen when Dan Uzan was killed. I had the occasion to visit Copenhagen 6 months before then. At the time, the Jewish community coming after the war in Gaza in 2014, that summer, was really concerned about its security. It faced physical attacks at both the neighborhoods of the synagogue, of the school, and they made a very basic request to their government. Provide police in front of the school when kids are being dropped off and picked up. On Shabbat, when people are going to synagogue, provide some police protection. It seemed a modest and obvious request, and yet the government wasn't doing this. So when I had the opportunity to raise this at my meetings, representatives of the Interior Department, the police, others in government, they said to me, you know, in a way they kind of lectured me. They said, Rabbi Baker, in Denmark, we have a relaxed approach to security. A relaxed approach. What did that mean? Well, our citizens would feel uncomfortable if they saw armed police in front of these buildings. In fact, look at the parliament. There was not armed police in front. So the government had to balance. Do they want to make their citizens feel uncomfortable by seeing these armed guards? Or would they take on a responsibility of providing protection for their Jewish community? And as we know, until the horrific event that February, they had made their decision. They didn't want to discomfort the larger population. So we can look back, we see what a struggle it has been to get governments to acknowledge and then to get governments to step forward. We heard yesterday from Natan Sharansky of how the Jewish Agency is providing security support for communities. We know, and Ari Musicant is here, no one knows better what communities need and what the EJC has been doing to offer security. But it's important for all of us to say, first and foremost, this is the government's responsibility. It's the government's responsibility to provide that security, whether in police protection or in the necessary finance to provide enhanced measures that we all know Jewish communities need. More of that is happening. I'm pleased that only last year the OSCE's Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights issued a very clear, practical guide for Jewish community security. And in this guide, and Mike Wine is here, he played a critical role in its development. In this guide, it recommends that governments provide the necessary financial means to enhance the security of buildings, to take the police and give it its responsibility in this case. So we need to push this. We need to push this more, because even today, in Sweden, the community is spending 30% of its budget just on security. And in Switzerland, the government has said again, yes, it may be needed, but it's up to the community to take care of it. We need to understand anti-Semitism. We heard earlier, defining it is critical. But in this very basic area, governments know what to do. Now they have to step forward. The basic principle of religious freedom. Jewish communities today are challenged in ways when even anti-Semitism, a basic reality for centuries, never challenged this. The ability of Brit Milah to circumcise one's infant son, or to provide kosher food, shchita, religious slaughter. But now, in the name of children's rights or animal rights activists, these basic elemental rights, elemental needs of Jewish life are being challenged. When this issue arose several years ago in the Netherlands, I recall one Jewish leader saying to me, well, we're making the argument to preserve this right of religious slaughter, but I'm not basing it on religious freedom. Frankly, I think more Dutch citizens believe in animal rights than in religious freedom. We see even today calls coming from our friends in Denmark. They fear now new efforts to adopt legislation that would prohibit altogether the right of parents to circumcise their sons. It could put them, in fact, in prison for doing so. It's a draft law that would even put in prison parents who took their children outside of the country for this and returned. How can this be if there ought to be a basic protection of religious freedom? And so it is something that, yes, both Jews and Muslims share. The practices themselves may be different. The challenge is somewhat different, but together there's at least a recognition this has to be fought. We see today a proposal presented in the Parliament of Iceland that would ban circumcision, child circumcision, infant circumcision. There are far more people here today than there are Jews in Iceland. When I discussed this issue only a week ago with the ambassador of Iceland in Washington, he said to me, we have documentation that in the last 10 years, there were 14 circumcisions that took place in Iceland. And yet here it is, a country with hardly any Jews, with perhaps a few hundred Muslims, and it wants to ban this basic practice. Actually, it's concerning the community in Denmark because they feel it will set a precedent. Nordic countries somehow will look one to another, and it will open the door. And so here we are, fighting for the protection of an elemental religious practice on behalf of frankly, a handful of people who may themselves never actually exercise it. But again, it points to a sad reality today. And if we talk about anti-Semitism as threats to Jewish life, this is in its own way an existential threat to Jewish life. And we have to acknowledge the kind of public discourse that is created, that accompanies these debates, as we saw all too well in Germany, in that country, when there were efforts ultimately successful to preserve the right of this practice. And then to turn to one last area. Europe without Jews wouldn't be Europe. This is also a challenge of Europe dealing with its history, of frankly a time when it looked like Europe would be without Jews. And so what kind of assurance, what kind of security, what kind of support do governments today give for the continuation of Jewish life, for the sense of well-being, for the sense of being rooted? Part of that is acknowledging one's history. It has not come easy to countries that had the opportunity for decades. We know here in Austria, it was only in 1995 that Austria formally accepted its responsibility, that it established a national fund for Nazi victims. The same was true for France, only in 1995. Other Western European democracies have taken decades to address this. So we cannot assume it is simple and easy for countries that for half a century were under communism to deal with this complicated past. They've had less time. They've seen themselves as victims, so it was not easy to then look in the mirror and acknowledge the role as perpetrators and collaborators. But progress was made in almost all these countries. We saw it, a struggle in the 90s to really say, okay, fascist-era leaders should not be models for national identity. Much as different elements in those societies were looking back to the Antonescus, to the Horthys, to the Tissos. Collectively, we helped push back. There was a very fine and critical museum detailing the Holocaust in Hungary that was built in Budapest. It told the story. And yet we've seen in recent years the same government that established that first museum wanting to establish a new museum with a different narrative. As Mark so rightly pointed out, we're not talking now about denial, but we're talking about distortion, about changing that narrative. That's part of the struggle going on today in Poland, but it's not unique to Poland. So all of this raises, again, the question, do you really want Jews to remain? If so, if you take Hungary, a country that has a Jewish population almost entirely composed of survivors and their descendants, what you say and do, or what you don't say and what you don't do regarding that history has a very real impact on how they see themselves today, how they see their future in their own country. And we can see in the larger struggle with the growth of right-wing and nationalist parties, if anything, a new generation that's picking up on these old fascist leaders. With this in mind, I think we have to say, we have to acknowledge, we have to work. Accuracy in that history is not just about history. It's not just about yesterday. It's also about tomorrow. And yes, it's a responsibility for governments, even if they're not living up to it. We surely need to focus that attention today, country by country, and hopefully with some of our multinational organizations, with the EU, with the work that FRA does, with the OSCE, with all of its complications as a consensus organization. Much has happened, much positive has been done, but so much more still remains. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to Andy Baker for a very thorough and comprehensive look at the current situation, an overview of what the reality that's out there that we're dealing with today. I think one of the key aspects of this conference is that it's not limited to any historical period. We deal with periodization only, but it's an opportunity for both scholars and experts who are working on this to draw a unified picture, an integrated picture, leading up to the current situation and the roots perhaps that brought it to that. And Andy, thank you for giving that overview of what is happening today in the OSCE region and beyond, and for all you've done in the past.